What's up, everybody? This is Jose from Southern Life. I pulled up listening to OJ the Juice Man and kind of caught the attention of the troopers here. On today's video, guys, we're at the Gamble Mansion in Allenton, Florida. This is the last remaining plantation in South Florida. And it's even in South Florida. We're going to talk about all that on today's video. Slavery never really took off in Southwest Florida. On today's video, I'm going to explain to you guys why this, an Antebellum plantation, is something hard to find in South Florida, and why this is one of the few, if not the only, remaining plantation in Southwest Florida, why did slavery not take off, and what led to this mansion being abandoned and being a failure. So in today's video, we're going to get a little bit of Southwest Florida African American history and understand why plantations like this eventually became obsolete and ineffective in Southwest Florida. Many things led to the demise, and the idea of bringing slaves from states like Mississippi and Alabama and North Florida to this region of the state eventually all proved to be a failure. Not only did hurricanes ravage this area consistently, but there was many hurdles. I'm sure I meant to say hurdles related to plantations in Florida. So the walls of this structure are about 2 feet thick. And that is because here in Florida, the Seminoles were still raging battle against the United States. And the Seminole tribe was not only a Native American tribe, but they also had many runaway slaves that incorporated their communities. And that meant that structures like this, a plantation, while they were given land, they had to protect it. And the swamps to the south of here were the perfect hiding ground for many Seminoles. These were Indians who were supposed to be relocated to other parts of the country, but decided to hide out in the Florida swamps. And among them were many African Americans. Also, many of the European migrants who came here from places like England had a lot of dealings with the natives and the enslaved people who ran away and joined the ranks of the Seminoles, which means that, ironically, not only did the system of plantations not work in South Florida, but also just the general concept of the hierarchy of races really didn't exist in South Florida. Now, this is a cistern here, and we have a lot of information to cover on this video. So I'll do the best to compact as much as possible into today's video. These types of cisterns were really common in the country of Cuba as well. And really, plantation life in Florida, especially in southern Florida, would have been much different than plantation life in places like Alabama or Mississippi. The gutters that you see here would grab the rainwater and put it into a cistern. And in these cisterns, they would be able to keep the water from rain cool and preserved. Ironically, my family in Cuba has cisterns just like this in their property, and these cisterns are usually going to have small fish inside, and the fish are going to eat the mosquitoes and the mosquito larvae and ensure that the drinking water is safer. And ironically, what strikes me the most about the cistern is how much it resembles the cisterns that my family in Cuba has on their farms. See, today in parts of Cuba that are rural, these types of cisterns that look identical to this are still in use in Cuba. And really, you start to draw differences between slavery in the Deep South and slavery or just life in general during that time period in South Florida would have resembled more life in Cuba or the Dominican Republic, where cattle was much more sustainable than slavery plantations. This cistern that you see here is now at a low level as expected for this time of the year, the end of the dry season. And all of these structures were built with locally sourced material And what you're looking at here is a mix of burnt and crushed shell. And this is what made the 2-foot walls of these structures that we're looking at here. This is something that is regionally sourced. So you're not going to find structures like this anywhere else in the United States. The Spaniards used construction methods like this in places like the forts, like the ones in St. Augustine, which surprisingly absorb the impact of shelling very well, as this type of material has the quality of absorbing impact really well. And that is why the castles of St. Augustine are still here in Florida. And even in St. Augustine, for the most part, many of these types of slaveries that existed in the southern region of the United States were, for the most part, unproductive in the state of Florida. The life of a cowboy was very different from the life of a slave owner. The slave owner, like in this place here, would have had about 200 slaves, and they would all work on these big farming projects. However, the life of a cowboy was distinctly different. In places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and the vast majority of Southwest Florida, where cattle was the way of life, it would be understood that everybody, regardless of their race, would have had a role in participation with the cattle. And the lifestyle that slavery had kind of created in the South just wasn't a system that functioned in a place like South Florida. Many people came from Alabama and northern Florida, Mississippi, with ideas to create the slavery model of the Deep South in South Florida, and they all failed. This here being a prime example of a plantation that just couldn't continue. And it was a failure, and the plantation owner eventually returned back to North Florida, where he was able to continue his plantation and his slavery. But it didn't work here in this part of the country. And today we're going to understand exactly why slavery, the way it was understood in the United States, would not function in South Florida.
All that water under the dry sink here. The state of Florida has since put plasterboard over the top of the original wall to protect it from any further decay that it might get.
I gotta tell you, I really don't like the vibes of this place at all whatsoever. A tour starts at 3 o'clock. So we're gonna run up over here and get our ticket for the tour. There's a lot that I want to put into this documentary, and I'm kind of a little hesitant about taking their tour, since I feel like their tour almost just glamorizes plantation life. What I'm trying to do on this video is kind of show you guys why plantation life didn't really function in South Florida. Cotton was grown in this plantation. However, the main staple here would have definitely been sugarcane. And the sugarcane mills, at one time, were hit by lightning and burned down. Means it was kind of an unproductive just chain of events that kind of destroyed the prospects that they had for this plantation here. And the same thing happened in Bonita Springs, Florida, where from Alabama they brought slaves to try to grow pineapples and other tropical things that were being imported from Cuba. And they also failed greatly. The mosquitoes, the unbearable heat, hurricanes one after the other, and just the landscape, and as well as the Seminole Wars, really prevented South Florida from becoming a productive place for plantations. So a tour starts at about 3 o'clock. We're going to join that and just learn a little bit from the state of Florida about what was happening here. Is oddly a Dollar General and a Popeyes across the street. Just kind of the most random, bland businesses you could have in the United States. Overlooking what is undoubtedly one of the most interesting archaeological sites in Florida. And I say archaeological because, well, there just isn't too much history here in South Florida. I mean, South Florida did not lend itself very well to this. Plantations, farming. It was more of a transient place. And everything about the weather and just the way South Florida is just didn't lend itself to early colonization very well. It was only until the 1960s, after the invention of air conditioner and just heavy equipment, that Florida was finally able to be developed in some sort of way. Notice how there's gun holsters on the side of the saddles. It's interesting to think how many plantations like this there are scattered through Georgia, Alabama, and all over the South. But once you enter South Florida, you just don't see it. I'm gonna guess they really didn't like to see me pull up blasting OJ the Juice Man through their plantation, but it was bumping. So many people claim that this is the only surviving antebellum mansion in South Florida. Problem is, we're not in South Florida. We're just north, dang it, dump truck. We are actually just north at this point of the Manatee River. And we agreed on our channel recently that South Florida starts south of the Manatee River. So in reality, this isn't exactly South Florida. It's right on the edge of South Florida. And we know a lot of Floridians consider only Southeast Florida South Florida, but no, South Florida is a little bit more elaborate than just Miami-Dade and Broward. But here, in almost South Florida, lies what was one day a real functioning plantation, actual slaves. So what did lead to the demise of these plantations? Well, hurricanes back to back destroyed a lot of the crops. And because you're not exactly in a tropical climate, hard freezes in some years absolutely destroyed the sugarcane crops. Sugarcane, I grew it in Naples, Florida, right near the beach. It's at least 14 degrees warmer there in the winter than here on a cold night. And even there, we had years where the sugarcane wouldn't make it through the winter, especially if there's a hard freeze, which would happen on rare occasions. Which means sugarcane production here just wasn't successful. Not as successful as it would have been in Cuba or the Dominican Republic. Talking about the Dominican Republic and Haiti, in Haiti, slavery thrived because the terrain in Haiti was more favorable. However, the landscaping and terrain in the Dominican Republic was more favorable for cattle. And where cattle was the main source of livelihood, slavery had less of an importance. That is why the Dominican Republic became a mixed race country and why Haiti remained solely black, being that slavery in Haiti was much more practical than in the Dominican Republic. And these differences in the landscape of Hispaniola led to slavery being more likely on the Haitian side than the Dominican side, where on the Dominican side, both black and white worked together. Here in South Florida, right up until the 1900s, when the Everglades started to be drained, one of the largest businesses was the plumage of the birds and, of course, the skins of the alligators. And that was a huge source of income for the people here right up about into the 1900s. When the Everglades started to get drained, it became less and less relevant. And at that point, another lifestyle of Florida was destroyed. The island of Antebellum, just south of here, held an African-American community that thrived off fishing. And Cuban fishermen would come all along the coast and have fishing communities that were mostly temporary settlements all along the coast of Southwest Florida. Pushing back into the 1900s, when segregation became the land of the law, places like Punta Gorda worshiped together. And being that South Florida didn't have the same history, the same context of slavery that they had in the Deep South, it is assumed that possibly race relationships in South Florida historically were much better than in other parts of the Deep South, being that slavery was never really a profitable institution here in Florida. Another African-American community also thrived in Alba, Florida, they would have definitely also been involved in sugarcane. Later on, sugarcane continued to thrive in the area of Clewiston, where there's also a lot of history regarding to the sugarcane production. And to this day, many of the African Americans from South Florida also have a lot of Jamaican, Haitian, and Cuban descendancy. The same thing can be said about the Afro-Cuban population in Cuba, which also has a lot of not only African descendancy, but also African American. Like we said earlier in the video, the Spaniards also created structures similar to this here. And the Spaniards in St. Augustine actually had freed slaves among them. And this was a huge problem for the English, who did not view slaves as equal counterparts. Now, let's be honest, the Spaniards coexisted with freed slaves. It wasn't exactly a perfect model of equality, but it was definitely in stark contrast to what the English were having in Georgia. And thus, Florida became a real issue when the Spanish presence in Florida and also in the Caribbean by the late 1900s, early 1900s, 1800s late, had become a huge issue for Southerners as they wanted to expel Spanish influence from the America, leading into the Spanish-American War. For the Spanish were much more likely to mix with Africans. And in the Caribbean island, that is exactly what had happened. And to be fair, many of the English as well that were in Florida and the Caribbean islands were not exactly like the Southern Confederates. They also didn't really care as much for the institution of slavery, which did thrive on a few islands in the Caribbean, including the island of Haiti. And in the period of segregation in the South, in Fort Myers, it is rumored that Henry Ford and Thomas Edison's wives would be commonly seen going to African American salons to get their nails, their hair done. And it is also known that in Fort Myers, just south of here, a few counties over, that many of the white people would commonly go into African American bars and nightclubs during special events when certain musical groups would come to perform while segregation was still the law and there was a rope separating the white side of the audience from the black side of the audience. Nothing really stopped the whites from going on the other side of the rope and dancing all night with their African American counterparts, which means that while through most of the South a spirit of hate and resentment was part of the history, and believe me, to a large extent, a lot of the things that happened in South Florida were definitely embarrassing. Take Fort Myers Beach, for example, which had a sign designating African Americans and dogs not being allowed on their beaches, creating a beach that we did a video of right before Hurricane Irma, Bungee Beach, which was the designated African American beach. Not going to say that things in South Florida were perfect or that it was this beautiful place where hate didn't exist, but it stood in contrast to the resentment and hate that was found in the Deep South, where slavery was an institution, or versus Florida, where there was segregation as the law of the land, but it was kind of overlooked. Yes, there was segregation, and yes, there were efforts to have plantations here, but they all failed. And more often than not, what you have is the Seminoles of Florida, the Spaniards, and even some of the English that settled this area early, having a lot more business interactions and almost necessary for survival interactions with all types of people, where the more customary way of things being done in the American colonies just wasn't exactly what you had in the area South Florida. Let's go in there. It's 3 o'clock. I'm sure our tour will be starting. I guess they're going to be starting here at the museum. Let's show them our ticket and join the ranks of people enjoying this tour. People are going to be coming over here. The tour starts at 3 o'clock at the front steps, they told me, but there's nobody here. It's 3 o'clock. So I think they're coming over here now. So let's gather at the front of the steps and take the tour of the inside of this building. Well, we'll get some information from somebody who the state of Florida has designated as a real tour guide and not me who's making stuff up as he goes. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I do study this stuff. I know, have an idea, somewhat. Not certified by the state of Florida? Absolutely not. All right, guys. Looks like quite a big group for this tour today.
Then he got to that point in the river and ran his ship aground. Got off his ship onto the northern shore, which is this side, and walked half a mile to where right here in this general area and decided this is where he wanted to have. It was called Greek Revival Vernacular, and it's used by many of the wealthy landowners back in the 1800s. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., many of our government buildings built around that same time period have this same Greek Revival architecture style you see here with the columns. To his creditors for $190,000 and moved back to Tallahassee. Now, when he left here, he took all his furniture with him, so none of the furniture you're going to see inside the house is exact Gamble furniture. All right.
Gorgeous. Look at this piano that's in here. Wow. Look at this piano. Wow. Keep in mind, you know, for hurricanes, these walls would have been about 2 foot thick.
This is the dining room. He eventually did get married in 1857 after he left her, and he had 2 children.
Notice how the pictures are hanging, not nailed into the walls, they hang off the ceiling.
All right, folks, this is the office. You notice 2 different styles of desks that we have in here. Stand-up desk here, sit-down desk over there. There's an right. On the other hand, you need more light, just reverse that pattern. Bring it right back down again, cane. And one of the animals I mentioned to you was tobacco, and that's what I've got right here. This is a plugger.
The only thing original here would have just been the walls. Everything else that you see has been replaced. The breeze from the Gulf coming in this direction.
All right, this is the kitchen, and there's a fairly large fireplace. It is the largest fireplace in the entire back on to take the entire pan, put it in the fireplace, and bury it up in that hot ash, and you'd be cooking from the bottom and the top evenly, just like an oven does. And that's from the top of the coffee grinder here. Close this up, turn the wheel, and grind them up, and you have freshly ground coffee. Spill out of that bucket would spill into the dry sink area here and now onto the floors when you're finished. Sop up all that water out of the dry sink. You have a cutout here because white reflects the heat away from the house. The state of Florida has since put plasterboard over the top of the original wall to protect it from any further decay that it might get. Speaking of that water cistern, that's where we're going to head next. Door to the left, over by the bell.
Is there a reason that they didn't have the kitchen in a separate house? Because
We are separate.
that there wasn't a.
The Gamble Plantation Preservation Line, so citizen support organization. He wanted to use rainwater. You look over here, you notice there's a downspout that comes off the top of the house and goes right into the other end of that water cistern. Now the cistern is made of tabbies. You can see here it holds about 40,000 gallons. It's all a tabby that goes right down the middle of the water cistern. Now remember, tabby is drinking water. So he went ahead and put minnows in there, little fish. The minnows would eat the mosquito larvae in the water as well as the algae to keep it from stagnating. Bell. Slaves would hear the bell ringing out in the fields and knew they had to come into the house to be communicated to or to help out. We're going to head upstairs now. I ask that you please watch your step as we go up the stairs here and hold on to the handrails if you need to. Right this way, folks. Look out across the lawn. You see there are 2 stones out there. Those are not gravestones. They are memorial markers. The one over on the left side is World War I soldiers who lost their lives during that war. The one on the right side is the Confederate soldiers who lost their lives during the war between the states. Those are both put up in 1937 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. You notice a white picket fence behind the stones. On the other side of that fence, there are 4 pits that go down into the ground. That's where we believe the old smoke pit area was, where they would smoke the meat and then store it underground property and then sold off anything that wasn't nailed down. Well, in 1861, the war between the states broke out. The Confederate government came in here and took the property over and used it to grow crops to the Confederate Army. By the way, no relationship to Jen has to lay. And the property's given to his youngest son, Dudley, with absolutely no intention, but it was expensive to update this house. So he decided to build this house to feed it. A price was put on that of all the Confederate leaders because they were held accountable for lost trees and the road and the houses you see out here across the street were all non-existent back in those days. So you could actually come right out here, look out, and see about half of the Manatee River from right here. If there were Union gunboats coming down the river, you'd be able to see them from here long before they knew you were in this area, and you could go find another hiding place several miles away where they would not be able to find. Captain Tresca, who owned a boat down in the Sarasota Bay just south of us here. Captain Tresca, along with Captain Curry, came down the Manatee River in a cover of darkness, picked up Mr. Benjamin at the river's edge to go down on the coast of Florida to the Bahamas, and there he went out to Cuba, and from Cuba he went out to England. Once he got to England, he studied English law and became a barrister, and eventually worked his way up to be a counselor on Queen Victoria's court before he passed away in the year 1884 in Paris. Right in the 1850s, before the war broke out. Another picture of Mr. Benjamin on this wall, taken when he was a counselor on Queen Victoria's court. And the two gentlemen in the corner here, the bottom one is Captain Tresca, top one is Sergeant McLeod. They slept on a feather bed. You know they can be very lumpy and that's uncomfortable to your back and neck. So they usually set the slaves up an hour before bedtime with one of these. It is called a paddler plumper. And the slaves would use these on the beds about 30 to 45 minutes per bed, flattening and plumping the beds up so you could sleep on it comfortably that evening. Alright folks, this is the gamble bedroom. You look above the fireplace, see leaving on over the meter, those ropes tend to sag a little bit, your mattress will tend to sag a little bit, and you don't want to sleep on a saggy mattress. So you come around over here with a key, which is a long pole, stick that key in that tight position. There are two ratchets on either side of the bed that would hold those ropes in that tight position. And that's where we get the saying, sleep tight from, sleeping on tight ropes.
Do you know where that comes? Yeah. Where raining cats and dogs came from. They had straw.
Alright, this is the storage and dressing room area. Look over in the corner, you see you are still welcome to head over to the visitor center. Look there in the museum if you didn't finish over there. The restrooms are also there as well. We have a good example of two short, I'm going to go back over and open the visitor center. If I have a 4 o'clock tour, I will have to close it back down again, so gamble. Okay. Just don't happen.
Alright guys. It's actually a very warm day, but inside that building, it does feel kind of just, well, nice and cool. It's interesting how a lot of the things that, you know, the tour guide had to explain to the people here taking this tour were things that I really understood because I was born in Cuba, and in Cuba, my family's farm has a cistern just like that. Now, I grew up in the city, but my family had a farm, and they had a cistern in their farm just like that cistern, no different than that at all. And also, like the mosquito nets, I understand how that works because in Cuba we have mosquito nets. It's interesting how just going to Cuba in the year 2023 would be kind of a similar experience to living in the Antebellum time period. It's crazy. So this is the area where they don't really show you too much of. The tour is all mostly about the mansion. But out here you can see, what's crazy is they haven't even done anything to show you how the slaves lived. And there is, the Daughters of the Confederacy have that building over there. These buildings here belong to the Daughter of the Confederacies, which is the people who originally bought this place and donated it to the state of Florida. But there's not really too much as far as how the slaves lived. I want to show you something they have back here. Now, I've actually had one of these things when I lived in Naples. I don't know if I got any photos of it from my Facebook, but I'll show you that in a minute. These are the sugar rollers. So these rollers here would have been used to make the molasses or the syrups, which is, you know, really an important asset to the Confederacy, because, you know, with the Union federal blockades all the way around the entire, just kind of all over the South and the Gulf of Mexico, most of the sugar was being smuggled in from Cuba. You know, it was difficult to get things into the Confederacy. People were struggling to get a hold of things, and a lot of things were either coming from South Florida, places like this that were more isolated, or directly from Cuba. You can see these, or the molasses would have been melted, and I used to have one of these things. I think the one that I had was I don't think these are original, being that they look like they're single cast, and if they were Industrial Revolution, they would have actually been hand hammered. The one that I had was hand hammered, and eventually I got rid of it. When I moved to Alabama, I sold it or gave it to somebody or something. But the original one that I had was hand hammered, and these are probably not authentic. They're probably too small for a plantation this big. They would have likely been much bigger, and they would have been hand hammered. These look like there's just one single cast. Most likely, being a large plantation like this, I think it would have been much bigger than that as well. They would have probably been about the size of a car with hooks on the corners for chains. So I don't think this is exactly an accurate representation of that, but it would just give you an idea of how this whole process would have worked. And I think for the most part, when you look at this site here, they don't really have anything at all as far as the living quarters for the slaves. I think an accurate depiction of antebellum, they would have rebuilt these things, but they didn't for some reason. It would have most likely been long buildings, not just individual shacks, I think. I'm not sure. I can't remember if it's in Homosassa Springs or Crystal River, but along US 19 in North Florida, there's an actual sugarcane mill that is much more elaborate than this. And it was used by the Confederates when they weren't able to smuggle it. They were making it. But if you want a more accurate kind of depiction of the sugarcane process, I'm really disappointed how there's so much, really the way they give this tour is just kind of stressing how the Confederates ran away and their life, but they forget just the importance of the sugarcane production. And I think they've really put very little thought into this right here. But if you want to see more on this, there is a museum in Clewiston, Florida that has some awesome pieces. And then in, I think it's either Homosassa or Crystal River, but somewhere up that way there's a sugar mill that has a much more accurate depiction of what this should be. I just feel like they should have elaborated a little bit more on the sugarcane, being that it played just a huge role in the history of this. But anyways, that's just my personal take on it. It's a beautiful little museum here you should check out with a lot of history. And odd that I'm the only young person taking this tour. Definitely weird. It's just odd. Anyways, there it is. And of course, like we said, the combination of hurricanes, hard freezes, the fact that this wasn't really much about cotton, it was mostly about sugarcane for the most part. Harsh conditions in South Florida never really lent themselves for the slavery model of the southern United States. Meaning that most of South Florida, even before the Civil War, had just been a failure with their efforts to make South Florida productive. And Many people did try to copy the models of plantations in the Caribbean islands with things like sugarcane and pineapple. But overall, none of the efforts, whether here in the Bradenton area or in good old Bonita Springs as well, where they also failed. It's just a different landscape, not fitted for the colonial era of the southern United States. That is the end of my tour, guys.